The salt flats had swallowed grown men whole before, boots and bones and all. But Jane Aldridge walked into them anyway on the 3rd of July, 1879, because the alternative was standing by while the only town she had ever called home burned to cinders before the week was out. She had left before dawn, while the sky over the Nevada high desert still held the color of a healing bruise, purple fading into gray, fading into the first hard line of orange at the horizon. By the time the sun cleared the Jackson Mountains behind her, the salt pan had already begun to shimmer, and Jane understood, the way she understood most hard truths, without anyone having to tell her twice, that she would either reach Cedar Wells by nightfall tomorrow or she would not reach it at all. She had grown up thinking of that basin as a dead place, the kind of ground the Almighty had finished with and set aside, white as spilled flour for 40 miles in every direction, broken here and there by the black skeletons of long-dead sagebrush that had wandered too far from the springs and paid for it. Wagon parties bound for California had crossed pieces of it 30 years before her time, and the old-timers around Antelope Springs still told stories of the wagon ruts that could be found out there, and the graves that could not, because the salt took even that. She had a canteen half full. She had her father's boots, resoled twice, a wide-brimmed hat that had been Ezra Henderson's before his hands got too shaky to ride fence, and a folding knife in her boot that had belonged to nobody in particular. She had, most of all, the sound of Silas Croft's voice in her memory, low and pleasant and utterly without mercy, telling 4 hired guns exactly which building in Cedar Wells to burn first. 3 years before, that same voice had stood up in the Cedar Wells meeting hall and told the town that Thomas Aldridge, her father, had robbed the Comstock payroll off the Winnemucca stage, and the town, God forgive them, had believed him. Jane had been 21 years old that spring, standing in the back of the hall with her hands knotted in her skirts, listening to men she had known her whole life nod along as Silas Croft held up a torn kerchief with the Aldridge brand burned into the corner, a kerchief none of them stopped to ask how he had come by, and decided, without a trial, without so much as a magistrate sent for from the county seat, that the Aldridges would leave Cedar Wells within the week or answer to a rope. Her father had not fought it. That was the thing that still cut at her, 3 years on, walking into a wasteland of salt with the sun already pressing down like a hot iron across her shoulders. Thomas Aldridge had simply removed his hat, looked once around that hall at faces that would not meet his eyes, and said, "I raised my daughter to believe this was a town of decent people. I expect I was wrong about that, but I will not have her see what decent people do to each other when they are frightened enough." They had left with a wagon, 2 horses, and whatever they could load before dark. Her father had died the following winter, out at a line shack he'd taken work in, coughing blood into a handkerchief that had once, in better days, been white. Jane had buried him herself, in ground so hard she'd had to build a fire over it first to soften the frost, and she had not shed a single tear until the job was done, because she had learned by then that grief was a thing you could not afford until the work was finished. She had wandered after that, half a year of it, until Ezra and Martha Henderson found her half-starved outside their stage relay station at Antelope Springs and did not ask her a single question about where she had come from before they set a plate of beans in front of her. She had stayed 3 years. She had learned to shoe a horse, to read the sky for storms, to cross 40 miles of desert on a swallow of water if she had to. She had never once in all that time stopped thinking about Cedar Wells, about the neighbors who had watched her father walk out of that hall and said nothing, about the low ache of a home that no longer wanted her. She had also never once imagined she would be the one to save it. The men had come to the station 2 days before, 4 of them, trail-worn and short-tempered, wanting water for their horses and whiskey for themselves, and Ezra had served them both while Jane kept to the kitchen the way she always did when strangers rode in, because a lone woman at a remote station learned early to make herself scarce. It was through the thin wall between the kitchen and the front room that she had heard the name Croft, spoken easy and familiar, the way you'd speak of a man who signed your pay. Founders Day, one of them had said, a rough voice with a Missouri flatness to it. Whole towns fixed on the fair, cattle moneys all sitting in that bank, mining payroll coming in on the Tuesday stage besides. Croft wants the land office burned first, before anybody thinks to go through them deed books, and the jail second, on account of the sheriff's been sniffing round his paperwork. Rest of it, we take what we can carry and put a torch to the balance. Jane had stood very still in that kitchen with a knife half through a potato, and felt something in her chest go cold and then, a moment later, terribly clear. She had told Ezra that night, once the riders were gone, and the old man's face had gone the color of ash. His ankle, badly turned 2 winters back and never quite right since, would not carry him across open country at speed, and the wagon road that looped the long way around the salt basin would take the better part of 3 days, days the town of Cedar Wells did not have. The flats, cursed and deadly as they were, could be crossed direct in a day and a half if a rider or a walker was strong enough, and lucky besides. "I'll go," Jane had said before she'd let herself think too hard on it, because thinking too hard on it might have stopped her. "Jane," Martha had said, her hands pressed to her mouth, "that town ran you out, ran your daddy to his grave. You don't owe them nothing." "I don't reckon I do," Jane had answered, and found, to her own surprise, that it was true, and that it did not matter in the slightest. "But there's children in that town who never had a hand in what was done to me. There's old Widow Casey who used to slip me peppermint candy after church, before any of this. I won't have their houses burned down around them for want of a warning I was able to give." She had taken Ezra's spare horse, a sturdy dun mare named Pepper, and ridden hard through the cool of the first morning, making good time along the firmer ground at the basin's edge. It was past noon, with the worst of the flats still ahead of her, when Pepper put a hoof wrong into a crust of salt that gave way to soft mud beneath, and came up lame, favoring her near foreleg so badly that Jane knew, with the flat certainty of a woman who had spent her life around horses, that the animal could carry her no further without breaking down entirely. She had unsaddled the mare, turned her loose to limp back toward the firmer ground and, God willing, find her own way home, and she had gone on across the worst of the salt flats on foot, alone, with perhaps a third of her water left, and the sun climbing toward the top of the sky like it meant to burn a hole clean through it. That had been 6 hours ago. Now the heat came up off the white ground in visible waves, bending the horizon into shapes that were not there, distant mountains that seemed to float free of the earth, pools of blue water that dissolved into nothing the closer she walked toward them. Her lips had cracked hours before. Her tongue felt thick as a dry sponge in her mouth. She had stopped sweating some time back, which she knew, from things her father had told her once about desert crossings, was not a good sign at all. But she kept walking because there was nothing else to do, because behind her was Antelope Springs and ahead of her was Cedar Wells, and both of them needed her to keep her feet moving in the same direction. She thought of her father, of the particular way he used to hum under his breath while he worked, tuneless and constant, like a man who had made peace with silence by filling it with something small and steady. She thought of the church bell in Cedar Wells, how it used to ring at noon and at 6 in the evening, how she had once believed that sound belonged to her as much as it belonged to anyone. She thought, unbidden, of a boy she had known before the exile, a blacksmith's apprentice a few years older than herself, gangly and serious, who had once mended the hinge on her father's gate for no charge at all, and refused to take so much as a coin for it. And she wondered, in the strange loose way the mind wanders when the body is being asked more than it can give, whether he still lived in Cedar Wells, whether he would remember her at all, or whether he too had learned, like the rest of them, to forget the Aldridges had ever existed. By the time the sun began its long slide toward the western ranges, painting the salt in shades of rose and gold that would have been beautiful under any other circumstance. Jane Aldridge was no longer entirely certain how many hours had passed, only that her feet had blistered inside her father's boots, that her canteen had gone dry sometime past midday, and that the black smear on the horizon that might have been the cottonwoods along Cedar Creek might also, just as easily, have been a trick of her own failing eyes. She kept walking. She had not come this far to fall down 20 miles short. Phineas Abbott had been at his forge later than he ought to have been that evening, working a set of hinges for the new schoolhouse door by lamplight, because the schoolteacher, Miss Odell, had asked him twice already, and he did not like to leave a woman waiting on a promise. He was 27 years old, broad through the shoulders from a trade that demanded it, with dark hair that never quite lay flat no matter how he combed it, and a quiet, careful way of speaking that some folks mistook for shyness and others, more accurately, understood to be a man who preferred to think before he spoke rather than the other way around. He heard her before he saw her, a sound out past the edge of town that was not quite a voice and not quite anything else, and when he stepped out of the forge with his lamp raised, he saw a figure staggering in from the direction of the flats, moving in the lurching, off-balance way of someone whose body had long since stopped taking orders from their mind. He was moving before he had fully decided to move, across the yard and through the gate, and he caught her as she went down, her knees simply folding beneath her the way a puppet's do when the strings are cut. She was lighter than he expected, and hot to the touch in a way that frightened him, her skin dry and papery, her lips split and crusted, and it was not until he had lowered her carefully to the ground and turned her face up toward his lamp that he understood, with a jolt that went through him like cold water, exactly who he was looking at. "Jane," he said, and his voice cracked on it. "Jane Aldridge." Her eyes opened just barely, two dark slits in a face burned raw by 3 years and one terrible crossing, and her lips moved, cracked and silent, before she managed, in a voice like dry leaves, "Croft, tell the sheriff. Croft's coming for Founder's Day." And then she was gone again, slack in his arms, and Phineas Abbott, who had spent a good portion of the last 3 years wondering what had become of the girl who used to sit on her father's fence rail and laugh at his terrible jokes, gathered her up against his chest and ran for the doctor's house as fast as his legs would carry him. Dr. Alvin Pratt was an old man with a steady hand and a face that had seen enough of the desert's cruelty to know it on sight, and he worked over Jane through the night with cool cloths and small, careful sips of water, and once she could keep it down, a broth thin enough not to shock a stomach on that long empty. Phineas sat in the doctor's front room the whole while, refusing to go home, turning his hat over and over in his hands until the brim had gone soft, and when Martha Henderson's name came up in Jane's fevered muttering, along with Ezra's, and the word salt, and the word alone, over and over, alone, alone, he found something in his chest tighten that he did not have a polite word for. Sheriff Wyatt Dunlap arrived a little past midnight, roused from his bed by the boy Phineas had sent running, and he stood in the doorway of the doctor's spare room with his hat still on and his arms crossed, looking down at the ruined, sun-burned, sleeping shape of a woman he plainly recognized. "That's the Aldridge girl," he said, in the flat tone of a man stating a fact he did not entirely welcome. "That's Jane Aldridge," Phineas said, "and she near killed herself crossing the flats to bring us a warning, and I think, Sheriff, we ought to hear it before we decide what else we think about her." Dunlap's jaw worked. He had been sheriff of Cedar Wells for 11 years, long enough to have presided, uneasily, over the meeting that ran the Aldridges out, though he had said little at the time beyond a token protest that had gone nowhere against Silas Croft's momentum. Whether it was guilt or simple duty that kept him standing in that doorway, Phineas could not have said, but the sheriff did not leave. It was near dawn before Jane woke fully, propped up against pillows with a cup of water in her trembling hand, her voice still rough as gravel but her eyes clear now, sharp with the same urgency that had carried her across 40 miles of poisoned white ground. "They mean to hit the town during Founder's Day," she said, looking not at Dunlap first, but at Phineas as though she had already decided, in whatever half-conscious way a person decides such things, that he was the one who would believe her. 4 men, maybe more by now, working for Silas Croft. They mean to burn the land office first, to destroy the deed records, and the jail second, because you've been looking into his paperwork, Sheriff, and he means to stop you before you find whatever it is he's hiding. Then they'll take the bank money and whatever else they can carry and burn the rest." Dunlap's face had gone very still. "How do you know this?" "Because I heard 4 of Croft's men say it plain, at Antelope Springs, not 3 days past, thinking there was nobody in that kitchen but an old woman too deaf to matter." Jane's hand, holding the cup, was shaking, whether from exhaustion or from something else. Phineas could not tell. "I know what it is to be disbelieved by this town, Sheriff. I lived through it once already. I did not walk across that salt flat and nearly die doing it so that you could disbelieve me twice." There was a long silence in that small room, broken only by the doctor moving quietly at his cabinet, and then Wyatt Dunlap took his hat off, which was, for a man like him, close to an apology. "Founder's Day is in 3 days," he said. "I reckon we'd best get ready." Word spread through Cedar Wells the way word always spreads through a small town, faster than any rider could carry it, and by noon the following day there was hardly a soul in the place who had not heard, in one version or another, that Jane Aldridge had crossed the salt flats alone to warn them of an outlaw raid, and that Silas Croft, respected member of the town council, prosperous cattle buyer, and a man who had donated the very bell that hung in the church tower, stood accused at the heart of it. Not everyone believed her. There were those who said the Aldridge girl had come back with a grudge and a story to match it, that she meant to see the town burn with her own eyes for revenge, that no woman crossed 40 miles of deadly salt out of pure goodness of heart. Croft himself, when confronted by Dunlap with careful, deliberate questions about the deed records and the survey line for the new railroad spur that was rumored to be coming through the old Aldridge land, had laughed the whole business off as the ravings of a desperate girl who ought to be run out of town a second time for slander. But there were others too, and among them most vocal was Phineas Abbott. He stood up in the very same meeting hall where, 3 years before, he had been a younger man who had watched Thomas Aldridge stripped of his good name and had said nothing, too young, too unsure of his own standing in the town, to speak against Silas Croft's momentum. He was not that young man any longer, and he did not intend to make the same mistake twice. "I was here the night this town ran Thomas Aldridge out on the word of a kerchief nobody thought to ask questions about," Phineas said, his voice carrying to the back of the hall where, 3 years before, a frightened young woman had stood twisting her skirts in her hands. "I have regretted my silence every day since, and I will not be silent again. Jane Aldridge walked 40 miles across ground that has killed stronger men than any of us, on foot, alone, with a lamed horse behind her, and not one drop of water left in her canteen by the time she reached the edge of town, to warn a place that showed her family nothing but cruelty. I do not know what kind of woman does a thing like that if she means us harm. I only know what kind of woman does it if she means us well, and I am asking this town to be smarter this time than it was 3 years ago." There was a murmur through the hall, and Jane, seated near the back with Dr. Pratt's insistence still ringing in her ears about not overtaxing herself, felt something crack open in her chest that she had thought sealed for good. Old Widow Casey stood up next, leaning on her cane, and said in her thin, carrying voice that she for one remembered a little girl who used to bring her peppermint candy from her father's saddlebag every Sunday, and that she had been ashamed of this town's conduct 3 years past, and had never found the courage to say so until now. And if Jane Aldridge said there were outlaws coming, then by heaven, Widow Casey intended to load her late husband's shotgun and be ready for them. Sheriff Dunlap, for his part, laid out what his own quiet investigation had already found. In the weeks before Jane's arrival had confirmed his worst suspicions. A set of survey papers showing the new rail spur cutting directly across the old Aldridge boundary, and a transfer deed for that same land, filed in Silas Croft's name, dated suspiciously close to the very week the Aldridges had been driven out. It was not quite proof enough to hang a man, but it was more than enough to turn the tide of the room, and by the time the meeting broke up past midnight, Cedar Wells had decided, with the particular stubborn resolve of a frontier town that had been burned once by its own bad judgment, to prepare for Silas Croft's raiders and to give Jane Aldridge the benefit of every doubt it had failed to give her father. Silas Croft did not stay to hear the vote go against him. He left the hall early, his face carefully arranged into an expression of wounded dignity, and by morning his fine house on the north edge of town stood empty, his housekeeper reporting that he had ridden out before first light with 2 saddlebags and no explanation. "Running," Dunlap said grimly, standing in the empty parlor with his hat in his hands. "Which tells me plain enough what kind of man he is, though it does not tell me where his hired guns mean to strike from, nor exactly when." "They will come at the fair itself," Jane said. She had insisted on being present for that morning's council, over the doctor's objections, sitting upright in a borrowed chair with her hands folded in her lap, and a bandage still wrapped around one blistered heel. "That was the plan, I heard. The whole town gathered in the square, the bank full of cattle money and the mining payroll besides, most every man distracted with the games and the dancing. They mean to strike at dusk, when the light favors them and confusion favors them more." "Then we will not be caught unprepared," Phineas said, and it was in that moment, watching him say it, seeing the quiet steel that had come into a young man she remembered as gentle and unassuming, that Jane Aldridge felt something shift inside her chest that had nothing to do with fear of outlaws at all. The 3 days that followed were the strangest of Jane's life, stranger in some ways than the crossing itself, because they asked something different of her, not raw endurance but a kind of careful, hopeful courage, the courage to let herself be seen again by people who had once looked away. She stayed, at Dr. Pratt's insistence, in a small room above his surgery while her feet healed and her strength returned, and it was there that Phineas Abbott found reason to visit her nearly every evening, at first with some practical excuse, a report from Dunlap on the town's preparations, a question about how many men Croft's gang was likely to number, and later, as the days went on, with no excuse at all beyond the plain wish to sit with her a while. "You did not have to come," she told him on the second evening, as he settled into the chair beside her window with a small paper sack of peppermint candy he had bought, on impulse from the mercantile, remembering somehow, or perhaps only hoping, that it might mean something to her. "I expect the whole town has questions enough for you to answer without spending your evenings up here with me." "I expect they do," Phineas agreed, "and I have answered most of them. But there is a difference, Miss Aldridge, between duty and choosing, and I find that when it comes to sitting with you, I am not doing it out of duty." Jane felt her cheeks warm, an unfamiliar and not unwelcome sensation after 3 years spent guarding herself so carefully against any softness at all. "You remember me, then, from before?" "I remember you," he said quietly, turning his hat over once in his hands, an old habit she was beginning to recognize as the shape his nervousness took. "I remember a girl who used to sit on her daddy's fence rail while I mended his gate hinge, and who told me my jokes were terrible, though she laughed at every one of them anyway." "They were terrible," Jane said, and found, to her own surprise, that she was smiling, the motion pulling uncomfortably at her cracked lips but worth the small sting of it. "I have gotten better," Phineas said, with the particular seriousness of a man defending his honor. "Marginally. I shall need convincing. Then I shall have to keep coming back," he said, and something in the quiet way he said it told her he meant it as more than a jest. He told her over the following evenings of the years since her family had left, how the town had gone on more or less as towns do, the church roof replaced, a new schoolhouse built, the stage line extended, and how he himself had taken over his late master's forge 2 years past when the old blacksmith's heart had finally given out on him. He told her, too, in a lower voice, of the guilt that had sat in him all this time, of the night he had stood in the back of that meeting hall, 21 years old and too unsure of his own place in the town to speak against a man as powerful as Silas Croft, and how he had watched Thomas Aldridge walk out of Cedar Wells with his head high and his daughter's hand in his, and thought, even then, that something terrible and wrong had just been allowed to happen. "I should have spoken," he said. "I have told myself so every day since. I do not ask you to forgive the town for what it did, Jane. I am not certain it deserves forgiving. I only ask that you know there were some of us who were ashamed even then, and are more ashamed now, knowing what it cost you." Jane was quiet a long moment, looking down at her own hands, roughened by 3 years of work at a remote stage station, and thought of her father's voice, telling her once, not long before he died, that bitterness was a debt a person paid to themselves with interest, and that the only sensible thing to do with it was to set it down before it broke your back. "I did not come back for an apology," she said finally. "I came back because children I have never met deserve to sleep safe in their beds, and because Widow Casey once gave a lonely girl peppermint candy after church and never asked for anything in return, and because, whatever this town did to my father, I could not live with myself if I let it burn while I stood by and did nothing, the same as those who did nothing for us." She looked up and found Phineas watching her with an expression so full of quiet admiration that it startled her. "But I will admit, Mr. Abbott, that having someone here who was ashamed, who is trying now to be better, makes the coming back easier than I expected it to be." "Phineas," he said, "if we are being honest with one another, I would like it if you called me Phineas." "Phineas," Jane repeated, and found that the name settled comfortably in her mouth, the way a good word does when it is spoken with feeling behind it. The town, meanwhile, prepared for war in the particular quiet, practical way that frontier towns learn to do, not with panic but with the steady application of skills already known. Phineas spent long hours at his forge repairing rifles that had gone unused in cabinets since the last real trouble the region had seen, mending wagon wheels for the barricades Dunlap intended to raise across the main approaches to the square, and fashioning, at Jane's suggestion, a set of caltrops from scrap iron to be scattered across the northern wash where she believed the raiders were most likely to come, since that was the route with the least cover for the town's own defenders to guard against, and therefore the route Croft's men would find most inviting. Jane, for her part, once her strength returned enough to be useful, proved an asset the town had not expected. She knew, from her years at Antelope Springs, how outlaw gangs moved, how they scouted a target before striking it, how they preferred confusion and fire to a straight fight because both bought them time to escape with whatever they had taken. She walked the perimeter of Cedar Wells with Sheriff Dunlap and Phineas both, pointing out where a man might hide a horse out of sight of the square, where the dry creek bed offered cover right up to the edge of the land office, where a careless watchman might miss 4 riders coming in low and fast at dusk. "You have a soldier's eye for ground," Dunlap told her, not without a note of grudging respect, for a woman who spent her time cooking beans at a stage station. "I spent 3 years watching every rider who came through Antelope Springs and wondering which of them might mean harm to Ezra and Martha," Jane said. "A person learns to read danger quick in that line of work, or they do not last long in it." The town's women, meanwhile, under Martha Henderson's direction, for the old woman had ridden in from Antelope Springs herself, the moment word reached her of what Jane intended, organized the evacuation of children and the elderly to the church cellar, stocked with water and provisions enough for 2 days should the fighting run longer than hoped. Widow Casey, true to her word, cleaned and loaded her late husband's shotgun, and declared herself ready to defend the mercantile personally. A declaration that made Phineas laugh for the first time in days, and made Jane, watching him laugh, feel something warm settle behind her ribs. On the evening before Founders' Day, with the town's defenses as ready as 3 days' hurried work could make them, Phineas found Jane sitting alone on the church steps, looking out at the last light fading gold and rose over the western mountains, the same colors, she realized with a small shiver, that had painted the salt flats the evening she had staggered into town half dead. "You are thinking of the crossing," Phineas said, settling beside her without asking permission, a familiarity that had grown between them these past days without either of them quite marking when it started. "I am thinking that I very nearly did not make it," Jane admitted. "There was a stretch past midday when I could not remember any longer why I was walking, only that I was walking, and that stopping seemed a poor idea, though I could not have told you why. I thought of my father. I thought, oddly enough, of you, though I did not let myself dwell on that thought overlong, since I did not know if you were even still here, or if you would remember me at all. I have thought of you more than I let myself admit these 3 years," Phineas said quietly, and in the fading light Jane could see that his ears had gone red, an admission costing him some effort. "I used to wonder what had become of you, whether you were safe, whether you had found some place that treated you kinder than this one did." He turned to face her fully then, his expression open and unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before. "I am ashamed of what this town did to you and your father, Jane Aldridge. I will go on being ashamed of it, I expect, for a good while yet. But I am not ashamed, not even a little, of how glad I am that you walked back into my life, salt flats and all." Jane felt her heart climbing into her throat, a sensation she had not experienced in longer than she cared to admit, not since before the exile, before the grief, before 3 years of guarding every soft feeling behind a wall built for survival. "Phineas Abbott," she said, "I crossed 40 miles of ground that has killed better men than either of us, and I did it half convinced I might die before I reached the far side. I have found since that I am not much interested any longer in wasting the days I was given back." "Nor am I," Phineas said, and leaned toward her, slow enough that she could have turned away if she wished it, and when their lips met it was gentle and searching and warm as the last light dying over the mountains. And Jane Aldridge, who had walked alone across a wasteland to save people who had once cast her out, found that she was, for the first time in 3 long years, no longer alone at all. They sat together a long while after, her head against his shoulder, watching the stars come out one by one over Cedar Wells, and neither of them spoke of the danger waiting for them at dawn of Founders' Day, because some things, on an evening like that one, were better left for tomorrow to carry. Founders' Day broke clear and bright, the square already filling by mid-morning with wagons and bunting, and the particular cheerful noise of a frontier town determined to celebrate itself despite, or perhaps because of, the danger hanging over it. Children ran between the stalls chasing each other with sticks, women set out pies and preserves for the judging table, and if a careful observer might have noticed rather more men than usual wearing sidearms, or the way certain able-bodied townsfolk seemed to drift, throughout the day, toward positions along the rooftops and behind the false fronts of the mercantile and the land office. Most visitors from the outlying ranches took it for nothing more than the ordinary caution of a frontier settlement. Jane spent the day at the edge of the square, watching the northern approach with a rifle borrowed from Phineas's own collection resting across her knees, while beside her widow Casey sat with her shotgun tucked discreetly beneath a blanket, humming hymns to herself as though she waited for nothing more dangerous than the pie judging. "You are not required to sit here with an old woman," Widow Casey told her, not unkindly, "when I expect there is a young blacksmith somewhere in this square who would rather have you at his side." "Phineas is watching the land office," Jane said. "I am watching the wash. Between the two of us, this town has its dangerous ground well covered," said Widow Casey, in the tone of a woman who suspected there was more to the arrangement than tactics, and said no more about it, though her eyes crinkled with something like satisfaction. The attack came, as Jane had warned it would, in the hour before dusk, when the light lay long and golden across the square, and the day's festivities had begun their slow wind toward evening. Most of the town gathered near the bandstand for the crowning of the Founders' Day Queen, a distraction so complete that Jane understood at once why Croft's men had chosen it. 4 riders came up out of the northern wash at a hard gallop, exactly as she had predicted, and struck the scattered caltrops Phineas had forged with a chaos of screaming horses and cursing men that gave the town's hidden defenders precious seconds to react. One rider went down entirely, his horse stumbling and throwing him hard into the dust, and Sheriff Dunlap, positioned behind an overturned wagon with 2 deputized ranch hands, put a shot across the man's path that persuaded him to stay down with his hands raised rather than test his luck further. The remaining 3 split, one making for the bank, one for the land office, and the last, larger and rougher than the others, angling straight toward the church cellar where the town's children had been hidden, a target that made Jane's blood run cold the moment she understood his intent. She was moving before she had fully decided to move, cutting across behind the mercantile at a dead run, rifle in hand, cutting the angle so that she came out into the open just as the rider reached the cellar door, already reaching for the tinder he meant to use against it. She dropped to one knee, the way her father had taught her long ago on quieter afternoons than this one, and put a bullet through the man's shoulder before he could strike his match, sending him sprawling with a curse that echoed off the church wall. At the land office, Phineas had his own trouble. The second rider had gotten inside before anyone could stop him, and Phineas, unarmed save for the heavy hammer he had carried up from his forge out of some instinct he could not have explained, wrestled the man bodily away from the shelf of deed records he had been reaching for, the 2 of them crashing through a filing cabinet in a tangle of limbs and curses, until Phineas managed to land a blow with the flat of his hammer that put the man down for good. Groaning on the floorboards amid a scatter of scorched paper, where a dropped match had already begun, thankfully, to gutter out against the wood floor rather than catch. It was the 4th figure, arriving late and on a lathered horse from the direction of the county road, that brought the true confrontation, for it was Silas Croft himself, his fine coat dusty from hard riding, his careful composure entirely stripped away, come back in his own desperate arrogance to retrieve the very deed records he had hoped his hired men would already have burned. He found Jane instead, standing in the doorway of the land office with her rifle still smoking faintly from the shot she had put into the man at the cellar door, and for a long moment the 2 of them simply looked at each other, 3 years and a great deal of grief standing silent between them. "You," Croft said, and there was real fear in his voice now, fear that had not been there 3 years ago when he stood in a crowded hall and destroyed a family with a single lie. "You should have died out on that Salt girl. Half of Nevada has died out there for less reason than what I gave you." "I very nearly did," Jane said, and found, to her own surprise, that her voice did not shake at all. "But I did not, Mr. Croft, and I expect that is going to prove a considerable inconvenience to you." He went for the pistol at his hip then, a desperate, foolish motion from a man who had spent his life letting other men do his violence for him, and it was Phineas, emerging from the land office doorway behind Jane with his hammer still in hand and blood from a split lip on his chin, who caught Croft's wrist before the weapon cleared its holster, twisting it hard enough that Croft dropped the pistol with a cry and folded to his knees in the dust. Sheriff Dunlap arrived moments later, out of breath from the run across the square, and it was he who clapped the iron cuffs on Silas Croft's wrists, along with the 2 hired men who had survived the brief, sharp fight, while the third, the one who had ridden toward the bank, was found already fled, his horse abandoned at the edge of town, never to be seen in that country again. In Croft's saddlebags, when Dunlap searched them, they found exactly what Jane had suspected they would: the original, unaltered deed to the Aldridge ranch, along with a second, forged document transferring the land to Croft's name, the forgery clumsy enough, once set beside the original, that no honest judge in the territory could have mistaken one for the other. It was proof enough, at last, not only of the theft of the land, but of the lie that had driven Thomas Aldridge and his daughter out of Cedar Wells 3 years before. The fighting had lasted, all told, perhaps a quarter of an hour, and when it was done the town gathered slowly back into the square, shaken but largely unharmed, the wounded outlaws bound and guarded, Croft himself sitting in the dust with his fine coat torn, and his face gray with the particular fear of a man who understands, all at once, that his schemes have finally caught up with him. It was Widow Casey, of all people, who spoke first into the stunned quiet that followed, raising her voice from where she stood with her shotgun still cradled in her arms. "Well," she declared, to nobody and everybody at once, "I believe this town owes Jane Aldridge considerably more than an apology." The council met the following week, not in the hurried, torch-lit atmosphere of the meeting 3 years before, but in the full light of a Tuesday afternoon, with Judge Harmon summoned up from the county seat to preside properly over matters that should have been given proper process the first time around. Silas Croft was bound over for trial on charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit arson and robbery, his 2 surviving accomplices likewise held for the circuit court, and the confession one of them offered, hoping to lessen his own sentence, confirmed every detail of the scheme exactly as Jane had overheard it at Antelope Springs. More than that, though, and this was the part that mattered most to Jane, standing in that same hall where her father had once been condemned without a proper hearing, Judge Harmon formally struck the old, baseless charge of stagecoach robbery from whatever record still existed of it, declaring Thomas Aldridge's name cleared before the full assembly of the town, and ordered the original, unaltered deed to the Aldridge ranch restored to his surviving heir. "It is a poor thing," the judge said, looking out over the gathered townsfolk with the weary patience of a man who had seen more than one frontier town make the same mistake, "for any community to convict a man on the word of his accuser alone, without process, without evidence properly weighed. I understand this town has already begun, in its own way, to reckon with that failure. I would only add that Jane Aldridge, in walking 40 miles of deadly ground to save the very people who wronged her family, has shown this town a measure of grace it did not, 3 years ago, extend to her. I hope Cedar Wells proves itself worthy of it going forward." The hall was silent a long moment, and then, one by one, townsfolk began to rise, Widow Casey first, then the mercantile owner, then Sheriff Dunlap himself, until near the whole assembly stood, not in judgment this time, but in something closer to shame and gratitude both at once, and Jane Aldridge, standing at the front of that hall with her father's cleared name ringing in her ears, found that the tears she had refused herself the day she buried him finally, quietly, came. Phineas was at her side before the meeting had fully broken up, his hand finding hers without either of them needing to say anything about it, and it was in that moment, surrounded by a town slowly, imperfectly, learning to make itself right, that Jane understood the crossing had cost her everything she had and given her back more than she had ever thought to hope for. The ranch, when she rode out to see it for the first time in 3 years, stood much as she remembered it, weathered by neglect but not beyond repair, the house Croft had used only sparingly in his brief false ownership, the good spring still running clear behind the barn, the fence line her father had built with his own hands still standing, save for the gate hinge Phineas had mended for her all those years ago, which, she noted with a smile that surprised her with its own lightness, still swung true. "It will take some work," Phineas said, standing beside her at the fence, looking out over land gone to seed with 3 years of neglect. But good land does not forget how to be good land, given half a chance. No, Jane agreed. I do not suppose it does. They were married that October in the little church at the center of Cedar Wells, with the cottonwoods along the creek gone gold and the air carrying that first clean bite of the coming winter. Widow Casey wept through the entire ceremony and declared afterward that she had never seen a lovelier bride, though she allowed that her opinion might have been colored somewhat by pride, having known Jane since she was a girl on a fence rail. Ezra and Martha Henderson rode in from Antelope Springs for the occasion, Martha crying nearly as much as Widow Casey, and Ezra, gruff as ever, clapping Phineas on the shoulder and telling him, with the particular bluntness of an old stage station keeper, that he had better treat that girl right or answer to a shotgun that had seen off worse men than a Nevada blacksmith. Even Sheriff Dunlap attended, standing near the back of the church with his hat in his hands, and when the ceremony ended, he was the first to offer his hand to Jane, an apology still living somewhere behind his eyes that he had never quite found the words to speak aloud, though the gesture, she thought, said enough. They settled together on the Aldridge ranch that had once belonged to her father, Phineas keeping his forge in town but riding out each evening to the land he had helped reclaim. And within the year they had built a second room onto the old house, and a new barn besides, and the fences her father had built stretched wider each season to hold the small herd they were slowly building between them. Their first child arrived the following autumn, a son, and they named him Thomas, after the grandfather he would never meet but whose cleared name and reclaimed land he would grow up upon. And Phineas, holding his son for the first time in the lamplight of the house Jane's father had built, wept without shame and told Jane, in a voice thick with feeling, that he had never in his life imagined a happiness so complete. A daughter followed 2 years after that, born in the spring when the desert wildflowers came up thick and bright even at the edge of the great salt basin that had so nearly claimed her mother's life, and they named her Martha, for the woman who had taken Jane in when she had nowhere else to go, and who wept, upon hearing the news, harder than she had at the wedding itself. Jane told her children, when they were old enough to understand it, the whole of the story, the exile and the grief and the long walk across the salt, not to frighten them, but because she believed, as her father had believed before her, that a person ought to know the true shape of the ground they stood on, the better to appreciate how it had been won. She told them of the peppermint candy Widow Casey used to give her, of the gate hinge their father had mended for a girl he barely knew, of the particular terror and clarity of walking alone into a wasteland with nothing but her own resolve to carry her through it. "Were you not afraid?" young Thomas asked her once, perhaps 8 years old and full of the fierce, uncomplicated courage of a boy who has grown up secure and loved, crossing all that salt by yourself. "I was terrified," Jane told him, honestly, brushing the hair back from his forehead the way her own father used to do for her. "But I have found in my life that fear and doing the right thing are not opposites, Thomas. Sometimes they walk the very same road together, and a person simply has to decide which one gets to lead." Cedar Wells prospered in the years that followed, the railroad spur completed at last along a route that skirted rather than crossed the Aldridge land, a small mercy that Jane never failed to be grateful for, and the town itself, chastened by its own past failure, grew into the kind of place that Jane's father, watching from wherever the good and the wronged go on to, might have finally recognized as decent after all. Phineas kept his forge running until his hair had gone gray at the temples, teaching the trade in time to his own son, who showed an early aptitude for it, while Jane ran the ranch alongside him with the same steady competence she had once shown crossing 40 miles of deadly ground, and on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children were abed, the two of them would often walk out together to the edge of their land, where the salt flats shimmered pale in the distance under a rising moon. A wasteland that had once nearly killed her, and had, in the end, delivered her to everything she had ever truly wanted. "Do you ever regret it?" Phineas asked her once, years into their marriage, as they stood together at that fence line, his arm around her shoulders and the desert wind carrying the scent of sage between them. "Walking into that salt alone, not knowing if you would ever walk out the other side?" Jane considered the question a long moment, watching the last light fade gold and rose over the same mountains that had guided her, half dead and desperate, toward a town that had once thrown her away. "No," she said finally, leaning into him, feeling the steady warmth of a man who had chosen, 3 years running now, to see her clearly and love her anyway. "I do not regret a single step of it. That crossing cost me nearly everything I had left to give, Phineas, but it is also the reason I found my way back to you, and to this land, and to a life I would not trade for any other I could name." She turned her face up to his, and found, as she always did, that he was already looking at her with the same quiet, steady devotion he had shown her that first terrible night, carrying her half-conscious through the dark toward help she had not been certain she would find. "Some roads only lead to ruin. I am simply grateful, every day of my life, that this one led to you instead." He kissed her then, gently, with the easy familiarity of years spent building something good together out of what had once been broken beyond hope. And behind them, in the house her father had built and she had reclaimed, their children slept safe and warm. The name Aldridge no longer a mark of shame in Cedar Wells, but a thing spoken now with respect, even a kind of quiet reverence, by a town that had learned, the hard way, the true cost of judging too quickly and forgiving too late. The salt flats remained, out past the edge of their land, white and vast and indifferent as they had always been. But Jane Aldridge no longer feared them, for she had crossed them once, alone, in the name of a town that had cast her out, and had found, waiting on the far side, not the ruin she might have expected, but a blacksmith with gentle hands and a steady heart, a home restored, and a love that had grown, patient and true, out of the very wreckage the desert had so nearly claimed.